You don't belong here anymore. Your husband is dead. So your time in this house? It's over. That's what my daughter-in-law said to me just 4 days after I buried my husband of 41 years. Then she tossed my overnight bag onto the front porch like I was some guest who overstayed her welcome. What really broke me wasn't the words. It was the silence from my son. He just stood there, arms crossed, not saying a damn thing. Not one word to stop her. My name's Janice Whitlow. I'm 67 years old. I was a wife, a full-time mother, and later the unofficial manager of our family's daily life. Meals, bills, grandkids' birthdays, doctor appointments, you name it. My husband, Richard, ran a small HVAC company in Southern Oregon. We weren't rich, but we had what we needed. We raised one son, Kyle. He was my whole world. I still remember the first time he skinned his knee on our driveway and cried for me. Now he looks at me like I'm an inconvenience. Richard passed just 12 days ago. Pancreatic cancer. 6 brutal months from diagnosis to hospice. He died in the hospital, but not before making me promise I'd lean on Kyle and Madison when he was gone. I wish I hadn't said yes. I should have known better. The funeral was quiet. Small. Just the way Richard wanted it. Kyle gave a stiff little eulogy, and Madison spent most of it scrolling on her phone behind her sunglasses. Afterward, they invited me to stay a few nights while I got my bearings. That's how Madison put it. I thought it was kindness. Now I know it was strategy. The first night back at their place, I noticed Madison had moved Richard's urn from the living room shelf to the garage. Said it was bad energy. The next day, she started reorganizing the kitchen and boxed up all the dishes I'd gifted them for their wedding. On day 3, she told me they were thinking of remodeling the basement where I'd been staying. Said they needed more space for Kyle's new podcast studio. Whatever that means. The whole house started to feel colder by the hour, and I don't mean temperature-wise. But it was that 4th night, the dinner that sealed it. Madison made meatloaf and served it like she was hosting a business meeting. All clipped sentences and forced smiles. Kyle barely spoke. I tried to lighten the mood by sharing a story about Richard's terrible golf swing. Nobody laughed. Halfway through dinner, Madison set down her fork like she was delivering a verdict. Janice, I've been thinking. This isn't really your home anymore. We need to reclaim the space and the energy. It's time to move forward. I stared at her, fork halfway to my mouth. Kyle didn't even blink. You've had a few days to grieve, she continued, but we can't pause our lives forever. You should go back to your apartment. My apartment? I asked, confused. I hadn't had an apartment since before Kyle was born. You mean, our house? She smiled like I was slow. The one you shared with Richard. But since he's gone and the ownership's complicated, we think it's best for you to, transition. That's when she stood up, walked into the foyer, grabbed my small bag, and tossed it onto the front porch. Just like that. The worst part? Kyle didn't stop her. He just looked at his plate, then said quietly, Madison's right. It's not healthy for you to linger. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood up, walked to the porch, and picked up my bag. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my phone on the steps. I bent down to pick it up and caught a glimpse of Madison through the front window. She was smiling, actually smiling like she'd just completed some successful transaction. I slept in my car that night, outside the grocery store where Richard and I used to stop for pie on Sunday evenings. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text Kyle. I just sat there with my seat reclined and Richard's old fleece jacket pulled up around my ears. But something strange happened around 4 a.m. As I stared up at the blinking neon sign of the gas station across the street, my grief started to shift. It didn't disappear, but it hardened into something colder, sharper, like a blade I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. That's when I remembered something Richard told me 2 years ago, in a moment I'd nearly forgotten. About the trust. About the paperwork we signed at that notary office. I'd laughed it off then, thinking it was just retirement stuff. Now, I wasn't so sure. And suddenly, I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was a woman with questions. And soon, I'd have answers. I didn't sleep the night after Madison threw my bag out. I just sat in the car watching the sunrise behind the Shell station, sipping cold gas station coffee and going over every single interaction from the past year. Every glance Richard gave Kyle when money came up, every time he told me not to worry, every time he said, "I've taken care of it." At the time, I thought he meant burial plots and life insurance. But now I wondered if he'd meant something more. By noon, I drove back into town and parked outside the old brick building where Richard and I used to get our taxes done. Sheila, the woman at the front desk, still remembered me. Her eyes softened the second she saw my face. "Oh, Janice, I'm so sorry for your loss. Rich was such a sweetheart." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I didn't ask for pity. I asked for access. "Did Richard have any trust paperwork on file here? Anything about the house or the business or anything he might have left under my name?" She hesitated. "I can't show you much without legal verification, but I can tell you this. He updated his trust documents last year. Said he wanted to make sure you were protected." That was the word he used, not the family. Not Kyle. You. She said he used the word protected 3 times in the same conversation. That one sentence opened something up in me I hadn't felt in days. Not hope. Something tougher than that. Steal. I went next to First Union Bank, the same one Richard and I had used since Kyle was in high school. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but I asked to speak to a manager. Her name was Michelle, maybe in her 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes. She asked me to sit down, and I told her everything. How Richard had handled the finances, how I was just trying to understand what, if anything, was left. "Your husband had you listed as primary on a few accounts," she said, scrolling through her screen. "Some of them are joint, but some are in your name only." I blinked. That can't be right. I never set up anything in my name. She nodded gently. "Technically, you didn't. He did, but with your consent. You signed off on everything. Sometimes people don't realize what they're signing at the time." That's when she slid over the first statement. I'll never forget the number. $48,293.67. That was in just one account. There were 2 more. When I asked what they were for, she said the deposits were monthly, automatic, all from an LLC named JW Property Maintenance. I laughed out loud. That was Richard's inside joke. He used to call me JW when I fixed the leaky faucet faster than the plumber. I thought it was just a pet name. Turns out it was the name of a legal entity, one that I owned on paper. Michelle said, "Ma'am, I can print all of this for you, but you should probably see someone who understands trusts. I'd recommend an estate attorney." Quietly. I nodded. Quietly. That word stuck with me all day. I didn't go back to Kyle's house. I didn't even text him. I checked into a cheap motel outside town, laid out all the papers across the bed, and stared at the stack like it was written in another language. This was the same son who once cried when I dropped him off for his first day of kindergarten. The same boy who used to leave me notes on the fridge saying, "I love you, Mom," in crayon. Now he was building a podcast studio in the basement while his wife threw my bag out the door like I was some old couch they'd finally decided to toss. I felt like a ghost, but Richard hadn't treated me like one. Even in death, he'd written me into something solid, something that had my name on it. I didn't sleep that night either, but not from grief, from planning. I woke up early and drove back into town, found a lawyer named Glenn Harwood who specialized in trusts and small business affairs. I showed him everything Michelle had given me. He flipped through the papers, nodding slowly, then stopped when he saw one of the deeds. "This right here? This says you own 50% of the house. Your husband never transferred his share to your son. That means Kyle doesn't own squat without your consent." I stared at the page. My hand shook as I reached for my coffee. "And this trust?" Glenn continued. "If I'm reading this correctly, there's a clause, a pretty unusual one. It says if you are forcibly removed from the property, verbally or physically, the house defaults fully to your name." I blinked. You mean because they threw me out? He looked up, dead serious. That means the house is legally yours now. I didn't say a word, but for the first time in weeks, I smiled. I didn't go back to that house. Not right away. I couldn't bring myself to walk through the door knowing my son and his wife were sleeping peacefully upstairs, probably dreaming about tile colors and podcast sponsors, while I sat in a motel room surrounded by legal documents that spelled out the truth they never expected me to uncover. But I did go see the house. Drove by it slow one morning, around 6, just as the sky was turning that bruised pink before dawn. Madison was outside in a robe, waving down a landscaping crew like she was the lady of the manor. I stayed parked across the street and watched her point around the front yard, already giving orders. That was the house Richard and I bought when Kyle was 6. I remember the day we moved in. He picked the smallest room because it had the best tree to climb outside the window. We painted the kitchen cabinets ourselves and laughed for days about how crooked the handles came out. Every scratch in the wood floors, every nail hole in the walls told a story. And they were about to rip it all up like it meant nothing. The part that kept me up wasn't even the greed. It was how easy it had been for them. How fast. My husband hadn't been in the ground 2 weeks before they decided I was disposable. Like my love, my labor, my history in that house. None of it held any weight once Richard was gone. It made me question everything. Did Kyle ever see me as anything more than a built-in babysitter, a backup checkbook, a sentimental fixture that came with the furniture? Or had I been clinging to an image of motherhood that no one else was actually participating in? I sat in Glenn's office again that Thursday, his desk covered in Post-it notes and yellow legal pads. I asked him, plain and clear, what it would take for me to assert full ownership of the house based on the clause Richard had inserted about forced removal. Glenn didn't sugarcoat it. You have every legal right, he said, but it's going to be ugly. They're going to fight back, especially if they've already assumed they're in control. I told him I didn't care about ugly anymore. He looked at me for a long moment. Then we start with a certified letter. Give them notice. Let them know the ownership has shifted. I'll file the documents today. I walked out of that office feeling something unfamiliar. Not power, exactly, but something steadier. Like my backbone had finally returned. The next morning, I did what I hadn't dared to do in weeks. I called Kyle. He didn't answer. Madison texted me an hour later. We're busy this week. You should really give people space instead of trying to guilt them all the time. No punctuation, no signature. Just that little slap across the face in the form of a green iMessage bubble. Glenn sent the letter that afternoon. I stayed quiet, waited. 3 days later, I got an email. It was from a real estate agent I'd never met before. Subject line, staging schedule, Whitlow property. Inside, a full PDF, photos of my kitchen, my bedroom, my wedding china boxed up in the corner of the living room. The house was already listed. They hadn't just assumed ownership. They'd acted on it, staged it, photographed it, scheduled showings, while I was still breathing. I called Glenn right away, heart pounding so loud I couldn't hear my own voice at first. He told me to sit down. There's something else you should see, he said. I pulled property records from the county just to make sure nothing had been tampered with. You're still listed as an owner, but there was a filing attempt made 2 weeks ago. What kind of filing? Your son tried to submit a quitclaim deed, one that supposedly had your signature on it. My blood went cold. That's impossible, I said. I've never signed anything like that. Glenn was quiet for a second, then said something that changed everything. Well, someone signed it, and they tried to backdate it 6 months. I couldn't breathe. They forged my signature? It looks that way, he said. And if that's true, this isn't just a civil matter anymore. It's criminal. I stared at my phone long after the call ended. I had believed my son was spineless. I had believed Madison was manipulative. But now I had to consider that maybe Kyle wasn't just passive. Maybe he was in on it. and maybe he was the one who handed her the pen. I didn't knock. I used the spare key Richard had left taped inside the shed, the one Madison never found, the one I hadn't touched in over a year. The moment the lock clicked open and I stepped into the foyer, I felt something shift. Not in the room, in me. They were in the kitchen, laughing about something. Madison was standing in my robe, barefoot, holding a mimosa. Kyle leaned against the counter in a t-shirt that used to belong to his dad. I froze. For a second, I thought I might scream, but I didn't. I just looked around that space and took in every insult. They'd replaced my kitchen curtains, painted over the trim Richard and I carved ourselves, even changed the cabinet handles, the same ones we laughed about getting crooked. And that laugh was still in my head when I walked in and said, "You're both trespassing." Madison jumped. Kyle blinked like I was a ghost. "Mom? What are you doing here?" "I could ask the same," I said, walking past them like I owned the place. "Because legally?" I did. "I sent you both notice. Glenn said you received it. You no longer have rights to this house. You never really did." Madison set down her glass like she was preparing for war. "That's ridiculous. This house is part of the family estate." "No," I said calmly. "This house was placed into a trust 3 years ago. And when you threw me out, you triggered a clause your father wrote specifically to protect me." Kyle turned red. "That was a misunderstanding." "No, Kyle," I said. "It was a decision. You stood by and let your wife toss my bag onto the porch like I was an unwanted guest. You said nothing. You let it happen." The silence stretched like plastic wrap over hot food. Tight. Unforgiving. Madison tried again. "This doesn't have to get ugly. We've already started renovations. We've got a buyer interested." "Then you better call them back," I said, opening the file I'd brought and laying the paperwork on the kitchen table. "Because you never had the right to list this house. And if you show it again, I'll press charges for fraud. And if you enter without permission after this conversation, I'll call the sheriff." "Don't be dramatic," Kyle muttered. "Don't test me," I snapped. "You forged my signature on a quitclaim deed, Kyle. That's not a family squabble. That's a felony." His head shot up. I watched the color drain from his face like someone had pulled the plug. "You're bluffing," Madison said, but her voice wavered. "No, I'm not. The county has a copy. They flagged the inconsistency before you even finished filing. Glenn has it. And so does the DA's office." For a second, I thought Kyle might cry. He sank onto a bar stool and stared at the granite counter like it might save him. Madison wasn't done. "You can't do this to your own son. This is cruel." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the hypocrisy was too heavy to hold in. "Cruel? You threw me out of my own home after I buried the man I loved. You paraded realtors through this house while I was sleeping in my car." Madison's mouth opened, then closed. No sound came out. I leaned forward, looked her dead in the eye. "You thought I'd stay quiet, that I'd grieve and disappear. But I'm not leaving." "You are." Kyle finally spoke, voice hoarse. "We don't have anywhere else to go." I blinked. "You have friends. You have her parents. You'll figure it out." He stood. "This isn't who you are." "No," I said, my voice calm but solid. "This is who I've had to become." They left that night, took what they could fit in her SUV and slammed the door behind them. I didn't follow. I didn't watch from the window. I just sat in the living room in the dark, listening to the echo of their footsteps on the front porch. I thought that was the end of it. I thought maybe I could finally exhale. But 3 days later, I got a call from Glenn. He sounded rattled. "You need to come into the office," he said. "Right now." I asked if it was about the forged deed. He hesitated. It's about your husband's will. There's something you haven't seen." I felt my stomach turn. "What do you mean?" "There's a sealed letter and a separate account. One that isn't in the trust. One that Kyle has already tried to access." I froze. "What kind of account?" I asked slowly. It's a life insurance policy, Glenn said, but not the one you knew about. This one's listed under JW Property Maintenance, and the beneficiary isn't you. That's when everything stopped. Because JW Property Maintenance was my company, or so I thought. But Richard had left another name on that account, and it wasn't mine. I walked into Glenn's office with my chest tight and hands cold. The folder he laid in front of me looked like every other folder we'd opened these past few weeks, stamped and clipped, neatly labeled. But when he looked me in the eyes and said, "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," I knew it wasn't going to be just paperwork. The life insurance policy Richard had taken out through JW Property Maintenance was sizable. It had been sitting quietly, untouched, nearly forgotten by the bank. The listed beneficiary was someone I'd never heard of. At first, I thought maybe it was a clerical error. But Glenn handed me a second sheet, a scanned copy of a letter in Richard's handwriting. I recognized it right away. He always wrote in uppercase when something mattered. If anything happens to me, this policy is to protect Janice. But should she pass first, Kyle is to receive it in full. My name was never officially on it, but that last line changed everything. Kyle came in 2 days ago, Glenn said. He showed them a copy of your death certificate. My stomach dropped. I'm not dead. I know, he said, jaw tight. But he forged one, from some out-of-state provider. That's how we caught it. The zip code didn't match. The bank flagged it and called me. I felt like the floor tilted beneath me. I had been hurt, betrayed, discarded. But this was different. This wasn't cruelty. This was calculated, premeditated. He tried to fake my death. For money, it took everything in me not to cry right there. Not because of the money, but because I had spent a lifetime believing my son was a good man caught in a bad marriage, that maybe Madison had bent him. But this was his doing, his signature, his decision. Glenn reported it. I didn't even have to ask. There's a line where heartbreak ends and justice begins. Kyle crossed that line, all by himself. 2 weeks later, officers showed up at their apartment with a warrant for document fraud, identity falsification, and attempted insurance fraud. Madison opened the door and immediately started screaming. Kyle tried to run. He didn't get far. He was booked and released on bail the next day. He hasn't called me. I don't think he will. Madison, on the other hand, sent me a voicemail so full of venom it barely sounded like English. She accused me of destroying their future, that I chose money over blood, that I set Kyle up. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Some people don't hear the truth even when it's breaking down their front door. As for the policy, the bank froze it until the case is resolved. Glenn thinks it'll get reassigned to me once the fraud is confirmed. But honestly, I don't even care about the payout anymore. I kept the house. I restored the kitchen to the way it was when Richard and I built it. Put our wedding photo back up in the hallway. Found the little ceramic owl Kyle made in 2nd grade and set it by the window. I kept those things not for nostalgia, but as proof that what I built, what we built, had value. And that I was never just a guest in my own life. People ask me if I'll ever speak to Kyle again. The truth is, I don't know. Forgiveness is a slow burn, and mine hasn't even caught fire yet. But what I do know is this. He'll spend years paying off lawyers and living under the weight of what he did. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I stopped protecting someone who no longer deserved my silence. And I think that's what justice really is. It's not about punishment. It's about stepping out of the shadow of someone else's decisions and finally standing on your own name. I guess if I've learned anything, it's that silence isn't always kindness. Sometimes silence just teaches people how to ignore you. I don't stay quiet anymore. If you've been through something like this, I'd like to hear it. Drop it in the comments. There's something strangely powerful about knowing you're not the only one. And if my story meant anything to you, consider subscribing. I've got more to share. Some painful, some healing, but all of it honest. Thanks for sitting with me through this.